We have John Dewey this week. John Dewey and 1957. Now we're going to go back in history to tell you what happened with education from the beginning of this country, starting with the colonial era, because we want to understand how we got to the point of John Dewey and what it was he was changing, so that we have a better understanding of why or why not it was good. I'll tell you right now it wasn't good, but you'll have to form your own opinion. I hope you'll agree with me. I don't want to knock that around, but I am going to move my chair straight so that I can look straight instead of turned at an angle. We are going to talk first about, so I'm skipping this first article in here. We'll go to it later, but it's on page 38, The Educator Who Turned Against Education. And we'll come back to that at the end of the week. But I want to start now with where we were educationally as the colonialists came over, because it took a long time. We've been talking about how it took a long time for the founding fathers to come up with their success formula. And we've talked about the fact that education was a part of that success formula. There is a documentary out there. It's not free. You have to pay for it. It's called Indoctrination, and then it makes nation capital. And it talks a lot about what happened with our education system as well. Takes a little tour of what's going on today. And the only thing that I would disagree with in that particular documentary is that they do not think it was a good idea that the founding fathers were pushing a public education. That was part of the formula for success. And so the makers of that documentary got a lot of things right, but they seem to be down on the fact that the founding fathers believed we needed education publicly. I think because they didn't understand what the founding fathers were actually describing when they were asking to have education being taken care of. So this is good, and it gives you some more information about even some other people with that process and what we see today, people who've tried to fight against it and what they have found, especially Christian educators who've really been pushed out of the system or forced to be silent. They can't talk about Christianity or religion in any way. And yet atheism can bring its full score right into your schools. The occult can come right into your schools, but you can't bring Christianity in. So it's a good documentary. That's just the one place that I would probably disagree with them. And I would venture to say, if they were to understand the reasoning behind what the founding fathers were doing, that they would not have reported it the way they did. But it took a long time, about 180 years, to come up with this success formula. And one of the reasons that it was so successful was public education. Now, public education not being what we consider public education today. That's the most important thing, because the people understood that they had sovereignty. They understood that they needed a government because that's the way the laws could be managed, but their rights and their freedoms individually came from God. And that by having a government system, they were not giving up their rights and freedoms. In fact, the idea of the government system was to try to ensure their rights and freedoms using law. One of the things that made it so successful was this universal education. So let's use, instead of using public education, let's use universal education when we talk about what it was the founding fathers really wanted to see with education. Let's see if I can make that S look like an S. Universal education, meaning all needed to be educated. Not some, not the wealthy elite like we would see in Europe, but everyone needed to be educated. And they knew that they had made great progress with what they had put together with our government system. And so I'll move my head so you can see that easier. She's trying to take notes over there. They knew they'd put together a system that was good, but they also knew that if people didn't understand it going forward, that it would be destroyed. And that is true. That is true. The reason what we have now is destroyed is people didn't understand it. If you go back in the first 30, 40, 50, 60, even 100 years of the history of this nation, I'm not talking colonial, I'm talking about from the time of the Constitution on, because it was a part of the education system. They understood the Constitution. They understood when their rights weren't being given to them. They could name the article and the section and the wording, the verbiage of what was wrong. And so that's what we've lost. We have lost an understanding of what they put together. And because we don't understand it, we don't do the catechism on the Constitution. I don't think I ever sent that out. I still need to send that out. But the catechism on the Constitution, we don't do it anymore. We don't talk about what it means. We don't talk about the rights and freedoms there. People don't understand it. They don't read it. We've spent some time learning about it this year, but I don't think any of us have a depth of knowledge sufficient to really to really stand up and say, this is wrong and here's why, to be able to elucidate that. And so that is something we all need to work toward, is understanding the Constitution well enough to be able to say, well, right here in this page, it says this, and it means this, and that's why that's wrong, or that's why we need to do that, or, whatever it is, so that we can have the ability to defend what's right and to fight against what isn't right. So that rejection of that idea that there's only an educated upper class turns us to this universal education idea. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "No other sure foundation can be devised for the preservation of freedom and happiness. Preach a crusade against ignorance." Preach a crusade against ignorance. Their crusade was against that ignorance. Establish and improve the law for educating the common people. Now, who had the direct responsibility for this? There weren't public schools. They weren't being paid for by the government or by other systems. The direct responsibility fell on parents, and most children were educated at home. Most children were educated at home. Eventually, you started to see some schools within their communities, but most children were educated at home. And that meant that parents had direct oversight and direct input into what their children were learning. As we've moved farther and farther away from the home for education, we've moved farther and farther away from parents' involvement. And parents are the ones who are given the responsibility to care for and nurture their children and bring them up in the admonition of the Lord. What do we learn in the scriptures? Thy children shall be taught of the Lord in Isaiah 54, verse 30. That's what he wants taught. 19:23 of Doctrine and Covenants. Learn of me and listen to my word. Walk in the meekness of my spirit. We have that need to learn. And in the early days of the church, Joseph Smith received a revelation that the saints needed to write their own curriculum. And Oliver Cowdery was one of the men who was charged with writing that curriculum, to find and write the curriculum for the education of Zion. We needed to be educated in a Zion-like way. That curriculum still does not exist. I would like to begin trying to put something like that together, but a Zion type curriculum, the curriculum that would prepare a people to be celestial, it doesn't exist yet. And there are a lot of good curriculums out there that just don't quite reach up to that level. And so that's what we need to reach towards and look for and improve upon. And there have been some fabulous education systems put together over the years and good curriculums. They just aren't yet at the celestial level. And that's what we need to be working toward. And that will require great inspiration to be able to write something of that magnitude. But that is what we need. Now, when they came over in the 1700s, what are they dealing with? They're dealing with, we just need to survive. Alexander or Noah Webster talked about education. He said, all government originates in families. Think about that for a second. All government originates in families. Who was the first parents? Adam and Eve. Who were the first governors? Adam and Eve. All government originates in families. And if neglected there, so if we don't govern well in our homes, if neglected there, it will hardly exist in society. Because what is true government? It's governing yourself using correct principles. And so if it doesn't originate in families, if it's neglected there, it will hardly exist in society. The foundation of all free government and of all social order must be laid in families and in the discipline of youth. The education of youth is an employment of more consequence than making laws and preaching the gospel. I want to say that again. This is what Noah Webster is saying. The education of youth is an employment of more consequence than the making of laws and preaching of the gospel. Now, that is very interesting thought, because obviously we have to teach our children, right? All our children shall be taught of the Lord, because it lays the foundation on which the law and the gospel rest for success. If you are not educated, how can you read your scriptures? How could you know if you're not taught to think and to process and to ask questions? How would you be able to gather the information and understand the religion being preached to you? So I can see where he's coming from. And I think they actually all hold some very equal weight. But without the education, you wouldn't know how to make a law. You wouldn't know how to understand or live the gospel. You wouldn't be able to read it. And so that is truly, truly important. And that was pretty much the consensus of the nation of what education, the importance of education. So in the colonial period, as we've said, they came and they didn't really have, there's no schools available among the Indians. Well, at least not for us. Right? So the education had to happen in the home. There was no place to send the children. And they're in survival mode. So what are they going to learn? What was their education? What was necessary? The basic rudiments of how to live, how to plant, how to build your homes. There were none to come and buy. How to harvest, because after you grow it, you got to harvest it. You need to know how to use it. How to cook. Kind of need that for survival. How to wash. How to protect themselves against savages. And they needed to learn and understand the weather. All of those things were important. The weather affected how you were going to treat your crops. So I need to get my harvest in soon because it's going to freeze. Can I plant yet? Am I past that last frost? What's going on with the weather? Am I going to need more water this week? All those kinds of things that fall into learning and growing. So one of the things written by Clarence Carson. He wrote a book in 1987, and he called it The Colonial Experience. He wrote, education was mainly a family responsibility in colonial America, and the extent of it was largely left up to the individual. There were no compulsory attendance laws enforced by government. You guys know what compulsory attendance is? Being compelled to attend. You are required by law to receive an education. If you didn't go to school or we didn't homeschool you, I could get in trouble. You could be put in juvenile detention for not attending school if you were skipping school. There were no compulsory education laws in colonial America. Most children got at least their early education at home. And what are the basic things they would learn? To read, to write, to figure, that's mathematics. And of course, they would be trained in housekeeping and the tasks of making a living. A lot of children would learn from their parents the things they needed to learn. And so over time, parents might hire a tutor to come and teach their children. It still happened in their home. A very popular thought at that time was that the use of the hickory stick was acceptable if the child wasn't obedient, wasn't learning the way they should learn. They somewhat misunderstood, maybe completely misunderstood the scriptures. Spare the rod, spoil the child. What is the rod?
The word of God.
The word of God. Spare the word of God, spoil the child. That was a little bit misunderstood. And so it was not unusual for very strict discipline and sometimes a hickory stick being used, because they did also believe, bring up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Right? So that early training was super, super important. Some of the daily activities: individual reading, responsive reading, so reading back and forth, responding to one another, and community reading were pretty much daily activities in a colonial household. So reading was the basis for the education. And you guys can see that. You know how to read. You know you can't access things without being able to read and understand them. So that was very, very important. And the Bible is your principal textbook. There weren't a lot of books in homes, but nearly every home had one of these. So this became your textbook. Are you going to learn good moral values if you're using the Bible as your primer and your reader? You're also going to be learning the things you need to learn about your Heavenly Father while you learn to read. We really ought to go back to this. Brigham Young talked about you shouldn't even learn your letters without the Holy Spirit, right? Because you want to make sure that you're being taught the things that bring you closer to God. But this became an extremely big influence on colonial America, not just their education, but everything that they did. The early Americans wanted their children to learn. They didn't only want them to learn reading and writing, but the principles of God's commandments. The colonial education's chief purpose was to support revealed religion. Why do we educate our children? So we can support their ability to live their religion. This author called The Seed Time of the Republic, Clinton Rossiter, wrote a book, Seed Time of the Republic, The Origin of the American Tradition of Political Liberty. And something he concludes is, doubtless, many a colonial youngster learned to read by mastering the letters and syllables phonetically, and then hearing the scriptural passages again and again, with the reader pointing to each word, until the relationship between the printed and oral passages became manifest. Now, phonically, what did you guys do when you learned how to read? How'd you learn how to read? What was some of the first things we did? Do you remember?
No.
That says B. B. Everybody say it.
B.
B. And I might have taught you what the name it was. And this says K. K. Right? And this letter says usually A or A. And let's see, this letter says T. T. And then we might put it together. And we would learn how to read. You learned phonics first. And we pointed to those words and we saw them over and over and over again until the patterns began to make sense to your eyes. Your eyes would see the pattern and put it together. Do you now look at a word and go,
No.
Is that how you read now?
No.
Why?
Because we know how to read.
You see the patterns. And some words you just know. I've seen it so many times. I know that says John. Right? I'm not really reading anymore phonically. I'm reading what I've memorized. But you started with phonics. Okay? So doubtless many a colonial youngster learned to read by mastering the letters and syllables phonetically, and then hearing scriptural passages again and again, with the reader pointing to each word until the relationship between the printed and the oral passages became manifest. You understood that what you were hearing was now what you were seeing. Printed versus oral. What you were seeing, hearing, and speaking. And so that became a part of it. And because the Bible was so important to the people, even the early textbooks were largely referencing the Bible, stories in the Bible, or moral stories. You guys have seen the McGuffey readers. You've used them. And all of the stories in there have a moral basis. Quite often, You're learning about how a child should treat a parent, or how a child should treat an animal, or how a child should treat another child, or how to get over the conflicts they might have. Those are the kinds of stories you were seeing in a McGuffey reader, as well as Bible stories. And so McGuffey wrote some books. Also, a very important book in the early education America was called the New England Primer. Now, it looks like primer when you write it, but they say it primer. This is what they learned to read with. Okay. And also, Noah Webster wrote some books, A Grammatical Institute of the English Language and the American Spelling Book, because you need to learn how to spell. 100 million copies of Webster's book were sold in early America. All of them contained spiritual rhymes. All of them contained biblical principles. So it wasn't morals disconnected from the Creator. It was morals because of what the Creator taught us. As opposed to today, when we might see a moral story, but we completely leave out the Creator, who is the whole reason to be good. Without looking towards Him and the reward of heaven, why would you do what's right? The answer is you wouldn't. There'd be no reason. You wouldn't think even about it. So they were educated for two reasons: literacy and to become self-sufficient. Along with this, they needed to learn a vocation. They needed to learn how to support a family for the boys, and for the girls to learn how to take care of a family. And a lot of times women ran businesses within their home. They weren't always not making money themselves. A lot of times businesses were happening within homes. And especially because you had higher mortality rate with fathers and mothers, you would have mothers sometimes having to rear and care for a family monetarily because the father was gone. You've got like a Betsy Ross.
Sorry.
You might need to go in the other room so you can finish that cough. You have a Betsy Ross. What was she? She was a seamstress, because that was a way that she could earn money to support her family, support herself and her family. Don't take that in the other room, though. Daddy,
Yeah.
please don't take that in the other room. Okay. Sorry, we're having a little coughing attack here. So, a child would learn a trade quite often from the parent, the father. So men like Benjamin Franklin, his father was a soap and a candle maker. The family afforded to send him to school for a few months, not even years, months before they couldn't afford it anymore. And he was a very bright child. A lot of the reason for them sending him off to school was because they could see how incredibly intelligent he was. And they really wanted to help him take advantage of that. But they actually could not afford, with a large family, they had to continue sending him to school. So they brought him home to help with the family business of soap making and candle making. One of the things his father recognized, though, was that he had absolutely no inclination for that. He could do it. Obviously he could learn it, but it wasn't something that was going to be a life's vocation that he was going to feel happy with. And so Benjamin Franklin really had leanings towards the sea. He really hoped to be a sailor. He wanted to go to sea. Well, Benjamin Franklin's older brother had been lost at sea, and that was something his father just could not handle. So what did his father do? My son doesn't want to go into the trade I'm doing. I'm not going to force it on him. He takes it and they walk the city, and they watched brick makers, and they watched what else did he watch? I have to read it here. Bricklayers, turners, braziers, joiners. He watched them at their work and just observed his son. Did anything that he was watching seem to spark his interest? Did it seem to be something that he would want to do? Because what his father was hoping was, one, get his son a trade. He needed a trade. And two, keep him on land. I don't want my son going to sea. And so One of the things actually that really appealed to Benjamin Franklin was books and reading. And we find later writing. The Poor Richard's Almanac, that was a Benjamin Franklin publication. He wrote a lot of what was in there. The Silence Dogood letters. You guys remember the story about the Silence Dogood letters? What can you remember about it? Because he was, where was he working first? What was he doing?
He was working at a print shop with his brother.
So he was an apprentice to his brother. We'll talk about apprenticeship in a minute. Go ahead.
And he would write, like letters, and like he had pen name. His name was Silence Dogood.
And who was Silence Dogood supposed to be? Do you remember that?
Silence Dogood was an old woman.
A widow.
A widow. And I don't remember.
Okay. So Benjamin Franklin was always a thinker. Great mind, always a thinker. And his brothers and his friends, other workers in the shop, would sit around and talk about what's going on in the political day. Benjamin Franklin was significantly younger than this brother. He was not the oldest child in his family. So an apprenticeship is where you would basically indenture yourself to someone for a certain number of years to learn their trade, to learn what it was that they did. And after that number of years, and they used you however they needed you, they were to teach you the trade, but you would also be a help to them. And you didn't get paid for your service. You probably had room and board. They would pay for where you stayed. They would feed you. They were also supposed to be responsible for your religious education, to make sure you were being brought up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And in exchange for that, they would teach you how to do what they did. That was an apprenticeship, and there was a certain amount of time set forward that you needed to spend with that person. So Benjamin Franklin actually was apprenticed to his brother. He became an apprentice to his brother in his print shop. And politically, they'd sit around talking about what's going on in the town and the politics of everything, and they would not listen to Benjamin because he was young. They didn't think he knew anything. And so all these ideas going on in his head, he's like, I'm just going to write letters. I'm going to pretend to be this old widow that's so wise and so smart, and I'm going to write down what I think, and I'm going to sign these Silence Dogood, and I'll just slip them under the door. They'll never know I'm the one who wrote them. And so he would do that. He'd write the letters, he'd slip them under the door, and they would read these letters, and they'd print them in their newspaper, because printers often made newspapers and circulated those. And so they'd print them in their newspaper. They'd sit there and they'd talk about how wise and how smart this widow was. Oh my goodness, she's so amazing. I wish I could know who she was. You know, he's sitting there, got to be sitting there the whole time going, you know, because he's the one writing them, and they wouldn't listen to him if he talked, but they thought his letters were amazing. And so apprenticeship and being trained in that way, he never had a college education. That was not even considered to be a necessity for most people. They needed to learn to read and to write and cipher, and then whatever their trade was, that's what was necessary to be able to handle life. And so that was very, very important. But this kind of training, not necessarily formal schooling, but this training in reading and writing and thinking and asking questions was so vital to the founding of this country. Without it, we would not have had men who could have thought differently than what they had experienced. What was their experience? Their experience was a monarchy. Their experience was having a king and that kind of a government. And yet, because they'd grown up with the Bible, and then they began reading other things. You had Adam Smith and his Wealth of Nations. You had the writings of John Locke, who was writing more about this type of thing. They would read Socrates and learn about his ideas of government and republicanism. And they would read all of these things, and those are the kinds of educational things that came out. Now, you might think, well, somebody that only learned to read and write and cipher and then maybe had some apprenticeship training probably didn't write very well. Well, let's go back and read something that they wrote. Every time I read something that they wrote, I have to stop and I have to look at the words and I have to think about what they meant. And when I'm teaching it to you and I'm reading it out loud, I've had to do it today. What did I have to do? Stop and explain words to you. stop and explain what a certain passage, a certain line meant. Did you notice that? When I read those things, uneducated my eye, these are extremely educated men. Why? Because this was their primer. The language of the Bible is where they learned language. Now, those of you who have grown up with the scriptures, the language of the Bible doesn't seem that difficult. There's times when maybe you don't understand a passage and you go back and you reread it and try to understand it better. And certainly deeper understanding comes as I pull open my dictionary, as I look to other scriptures that use those same words, the word parallels, my understanding grows. But because I've grown up in the scriptures, you've grown up in the scriptures, as a general rule, does scriptural language confuse you much?
It depends.
Depends. But do you, I mean, Isaiah's different, but he's writing in code, right? But for the most part, can you basically understand when we read a passage of scripture?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If we were in them deeper, if you were always writing them and memorizing them the way they did, you might write like a Bible too. You might write more like these founding fathers did. We get a little bit lazy. Anyway, those are just extremely important ideas that came through that time. Thomas Jefferson expressed the free thinking of this day. He says, "It is better to tolerate the rare instance of a parent refusing to let his child be educated than to shock the common feelings and ideas by the forcible aspiration and education of the infant against the will of the father." He's speaking out against taking a child and teaching them differently than what their father would want them taught. Who has the main responsibility? The father. So let's read that passage again. "It is better to tolerate the rare instance of a parent refusing to let his child be educated." Rare. He says it's not going to be very many parents that won't educate their children. "It is better to tolerate the rare instance of a parent refusing to let his child be educated than to shock the common feelings and ideas by the forcible aspiration and education of the infant or child against the will of the father." It is not our responsibility. He's basically saying it is not society's responsibility to take that child and make sure they're educated because we think maybe that parent won't educate their child. Most parents love their children. The education of their children is extremely, highly important to them. And we might have different ideas educationally. We often do. But we also have different children. We have a responsibility to find out what it is the Lord wants our children to learn and then to go forward with that. And we know from what we learned about Thomas Jefferson that he was an extremely educated man and a very motivated learner. He learned 5 languages by the time he was in his mid-teens, right? He was one of the youngest lawyers in the Virginia territory. He was 24 when he passed the bar. Most people are still in law school at that point. And he's 24 when he passes the bar. And you guys remember that when he passed the bar, he was so well educated that he knew oftentimes more than the people who were testing him. So I think he did okay for himself. And then George Washington, let's talk a little bit about his education. He's mostly educated by his father and by his older brother, Lawrence. And he had a little bit of formal schooling from time to time, but mostly he learned at home. So he had to have a lot of motivation to learn everything he could. By the age of 17, he was a land surveyor. He already had a vocation and the ability to take care of the family by the time he was 17, and his handwriting was extremely skilled. That was an important skill taught in the schools, was handwriting. Not just that you wrote, but that your handwriting was beautiful and legible. This would not have been acceptable. This is not my best handwriting. This would not have been acceptable. But George Washington had beautiful handwriting, very, very skilled. And one of the reasons why is they would have exercise books and there would be things that they would have to copy. They called them copybooks. We've done a little bit of that, but not nearly enough. And that's why our handwriting doesn't come to that same level of greatness that theirs did. They spent time working on it. And so he would write, he has a collection of 110 polite maxims, and it's called The Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. Now, they were taken from a 16th century publication by a Jesuit priest. So something coming out of the 1500s is what he's copying when he does this. And so here's some of what they wrote. And these are kind of cute and kind of fun. In the presence of others, sing not to yourself with a humming noise, nor drum with your fingers or feet. 110 rules of civility. Kill no vermin as fleas, lice, ticks, etc. in the sight of others. So don't be sitting there going, oh, there it is, right? Kill no vermin as fleas, lice, ticks, etc. in the sight of others. Spit not into the fire, nor set your feet upon the fire, especially if there be meat before it. Remember where people cooked back then? It's on the fire. Spit not into the fire, nor set your feet upon the fire, especially if there be meat before it. Cleanse not your teeth with, you ready for this? The tablecloth, napkin, fork, or knife. It's kind of gross. Pulling up the tablecloth. Ew. Cleanse not your teeth with a tablecloth, napkin, fork, or knife. Also, some character building maxims. Let your countenance be pleasant, but in serious matters, somewhat grave. If it's serious, don't be going, right? If it's serious, you're going to keep a more serious face. Show not yourself glad at the misfortune of another, though he were your enemy. Don't be happy when somebody else has a bad experience, right? When a man does all he can, though it exceeds not well, blame not him that did it. If he did everything he could and it didn't work out right, don't get on his case. Blame not him that did it. When you speak of God and his attributes, let it be seriously and with reverence. It is not okay to take the name of the Lord in vain or to speak lightly of him or his gospel. Serious and with reverence. Honor and obey your natural parents, although they be poor. He's not talking about money poor. What do you think that means? Honor and obey your natural parents, though they be poor. Although they be poor.
Does that mean like spiritually poor?
Spiritually poor, exactly. If they aren't maybe teaching you everything that they should, honor them and obey as best you can and still honor God, who is the true parent that you need to be honoring. Let your recreations be manful, not sinful. What do you do in your free time? Let it be something that builds you manful as a person rather than being something sinful. Now, as they grew older, they passed laws that were really important. In 1787, they passed the Northwest Ordinance. These were rules or laws required of any territory that wanted to become a new state. Okay, 1787. There are a lot of things in there, but it's very interesting to note that they felt that this universal education was so important, they included it here. Starting in section 3, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government, the happiness of mankind, schools and means of education shall forever be encouraged. Religion, morality, and knowledge are necessary to good government and happiness. And so they encouraged schools. Now, what are some of the results that we have of this parent-centered education in the colonial times? Because I think that's probably the most telling thing of whether or not this worked, whether or not it did any good. Because that had a profound effect upon America and what we've become. So there was a report that came out in 1988, so almost 30 years ago. Did you get all this down, Emma, so I can erase it?
Hold on. I need the bottom one.
Yeah.
The Northwest Ordinance? Okay, I'll leave that one. I just want to be able to get some more information on here because I feel like you might want to see some of this next part in writing. It is in your books. You can always go through and mark it. I suggest that you do. But this effect here, so this is called the shift in focus. It's a report put out by the State Strategic Planning Commission on Education. And they called it the shift in focus. Principles that governed early schools were simple. The family was the customer. The home was the classroom. And the subjects taught and the methods used reinforced the family's perception of the world. Okay? The home, the family. Overwhelmingly, it was an agrarian world. Do you guys remember what agrarian means? Okay, vocabulary word for you. Write it down. I want you to be able to remember what it is next time I say it. Please don't run the water right now. Overall, it was an agrarian society, meaning a farming society, agriculture. See the AGR here? Agriculture. They farmed. They raised animals. Overall, they were 90% agrarian. They lived on farms. Religious values with some basic reading, writing, and figuring skills, a little history, and a lot of farm skills, all of which could be taught by the older members of the family, constituted the core curriculum. Now, you don't need to read very many things written by the Founding Fathers to know that that kind of education worked extremely well. Okay, they were very, very intelligent, educated men, all who started with that basic home-oriented education. But their speeches and the great works that they've written, the ideas that they stated, sometimes can't even be understood by the average college student. So if you're reading them and you're having a hard time understanding them, don't feel bad. The average college student today can't understand them either, unless they spend enough time reading the things that they've written. If they spend that kind of time reading and studying those things, their education level comes up too. And then reading it is easier. Just like reading the Bible gets easier the more times you do it. These are the facts I want to get down on the board, because the educational opportunities here in this country early on were so excellent, and they far outweighed and outclassed what was being in other countries. So in the early 1800s, there was a survey done by a man named Dupont de Nemours. That would be a French man. He was surprised when he discovered that nearly 99% of Americans were literate. Now, literate means they could read and comprehend. 99% of Americans are literate. That's pretty unusual, because he says most young Americans can read, write, and cipher. Not more than 4 in 1,000 are able to write legibly, even neatly. Not more than 4 in 1,000 are unable to write legibly and neatly. Here's the difference. In Spain, Portugal, and Italy, not a sixth of the population can read. Not even 1/6. 1/6 in Spain, Portugal, and Italy. Okay, 99% of Americans could read. Less than a sixth. In Germany and in France, not more than 1/3. Can you see what that would do? If we were to go to Poland, about 2 men in 100, 2%. In Russia, not even 1 in 200, 0.5%. And then if you were to go to England or Holland or the Protestant areas of Switzerland, it was going to come closer to this because it was considered a duty to read the Bible to the children in those areas. Okay? Look at the disparity. Can you even imagine? Now, this is not now. This is not now. I would think that it's increased everywhere now because this model of this education and people needing to learn spread through the world. It spread through the world. But in the 1800s, this is a literacy rate in the world. Okay. So I'm going to put the last of the similar to the United States in England. What was the other one? Oh, Holland. Okay. England, Holland, and Switzerland. Because they were putting the same emphasis on the reading of the Bible with the children. When they understood the need for the religious education, then that built up the rest of the education. Everything revolved around their Heavenly Father, and they knew it. Those literacy rates are crazy, especially because if you realize now with what's happened with our public schools, a large percent, I think it's like 13% was what we watched in that one report, can't even read their high school diplomas. So we're graduating them from high school with a diploma they can't even read. We've come a long way downhill from that 99%. Now, as the nation grew and as cities, smaller communities grew, they begin to pool their resources. They still recognize the need for education. Parents are still over the education, but they began to pool their resources. In a neighborhood, if you're putting up a barn, everybody came together and helped you put up the barn. It was a social event, right? Barn raising, and then you'd maybe have a picnic and you'd have a dance and you'd have some entertainment together. Community activities. Well, also county fairs and other types of things, that cohesiveness as a community becomes a climate where we begin to see what we call the little red schoolhouse. And I will tell you that those little red schoolhouses were not always red. They did not paint all schoolhouses red, just for your information. But that's what we picture, probably because of Norman Rockwell. That is what we picture when we think about those original schoolhouses. But it was a one-room schoolhouse. It also generally served as their church. So Monday to Friday, they'd go to school there, but Sunday is where they would worship there. If you needed to have a community meeting, you used that schoolhouse. Everybody in the community contributed to building it and helped to build it. They would pull their resources and they would hire a teacher. The community would hire a teacher. The community would decide what that teacher was to teach. So the parents still had their control over their child's education. And it would have been all in the same room. So when the children got home at night after school, what did they have? The same experience all day. They'd learned the same lessons. And one child might be reading at this level and one at this level. And what the teacher would do, it's kind of fascinating, is she would bring them up to the front by level. If she's working on a certain level with the reading and the writing and their spelling, all of those children would come up and they would have their lesson together and then go back and sit down and work on it while the next group would come up. And so they had this rotation throughout the day of different lessons happening. Math would have been the same way. History likely would have been taught to everyone, unless it was just part of your reading assignment, and then it would have been in your reading. So those children would have come home at the end of the day having had the same experience, hearing the same things, being with the same people in the same room. even if you weren't the one sitting up at the front getting that lesson, you were hearing it. So if it was something you already knew, you're getting a review. If it was something you never learned, you were getting a preview. Pre means before, right? You get to see it before. And I have experienced this even as a homeschooling mother. Emma and Catherine, you guys are close enough in age that I didn't really start to educate Catherine when you were of the age I was ready to start educating you. But guess what? She came along for the ride. So she learned her letters while you learned your letters. She learned her numbers while you learned your numbers. And Miranda and Joseph were learning syllables. And so she got to hear those syllables lesson. And my favorite story of all time is she stood up on her chair one Sunday afternoon and she said a 5-syllable word. It was a church word. I can't remember what it was. And she said the word. She says, "That has 5 syllables." And she was this old.
Wait, that was me?
Yes.
Okay.
That was you, Catherine. And that's not the age I would have taught her syllables. But she was hearing a lesson that her brain was ready to comprehend. And so she learned it. And she often learned her letters as fast as you were learning them because you're sitting in the same room. I wasn't even trying to teach her. So you can see how well that works. As a family, as you sit and discuss things going on in the world, maybe dad comes home and talks about what was happening at work today. If it's discussed in the family setting, the children are learning a lot about what happens in a business, a place of business. If you were a farming family, you come back and you're talking about the farm, and all of that discussion is part of your education. And so that is the beauty of the one-room schoolhouse. If it's not happening at the home because you've hired a local teacher to teach your local school, your children are still having the same experience together. One of the things that we lose by throwing children in separate classrooms, and we'll talk more about this, is we lose that cohesiveness of a family. You guys have not experienced this because you haven't gone to public school. But if you learn a different history lesson every day from each other, you have no common ground to talk about when you get home. If you learn a different religious lesson, which they don't teach at public school anymore, but if you were to learn a different religious lesson, you don't come home with something to talk about. You come home separated and disconnected from one another. It's destructive to families, not just the country. And so that's why it was so important. Let's see, what else? Okay, oh yes, William McGuffey. We talked about him just a little bit. William McGuffey wrote a set of readers. And if you were to take a look at these, there's only, I want to say there's only 5 readers in the whole series. But the 5th reader, the top reader, is at a college level. So in 5 books, you would take a child from the very beginnings, the phonics of sounding things out, to the top level of being at a college level of reading in 5 books. And they're not long. They're not even half an inch thick, maybe half an inch. They're thin books. Maybe some of them are 3/4 of an inch as you get to the longer ones because the stories get longer. But these books would have been part of what people would have used in the classroom, whether at home or whether in the school system. Everything in there had aspects of high moral development, high moral character, God-centered principles, while still teaching the basic academics, similar to using the Bible. I still think that the Bible is better. And certainly you want to use that as much as possible. And of course, we're members of the church, and so we also use the Book of Mormon. So I'm using those really scriptures is what I'm talking about. Scriptures are our basic primer. But you would learn those basics in reading and writing and penmanship and memorizing and arithmetic. A lot of times they would use, Ray's arithmetic. And I will tell you, those are not stubby little books. I've got the whole series. And man, it goes like that. He moves you through. But he did it in a word style. So why do we write word problems when we do mathematics? Because we want to know how to use that skill Not just I can do my times tables, but where am I going to use it? If I'm getting ready to do percents, how are percents used? If I need a ratio, how is a ratio used? That is why we write story problems, because we want to be able to apply what we've learned. He even had basics in literature, music, art forms, history, especially American history and including geography, basics in civics and the American system of constitutional government, even some basics in hygiene and physical and mental health, and how to treat others, especially your elders. That's some of the emphasis put on those in those books. What was expected, whether it was happening at home or in the education classroom, is that students were going to learn those Boy Scout principles: trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. All of those skills are part of a moral education, and that was expected. And what did this do? And we learned about this as we were talking about the early 1900s. This propelled America to the top. What are we? Less than 6%. Less than 6% of the world's population, 50% of the world's wealth. This education system works. This government system works. The education supports the government system as well as religion, because you can read, you learn the Constitution, now you're going to stand by it. 6% of the people created 50% of the world's wealth by the 1905 time period. And any country, as we've learned before, that emulated that pattern, why did this change throughout the world? This pattern was being copied. This true principle of needing to be educated, this true principle of good and moral principles spread through the world. And any country that put this into place began to see the same results. They began to see prosperity. They began to see people who better supported government if it was doing what it was supposed to do. Because things were going so well here, many students came to this country from other countries just to learn. And so it's important to remember how well this worked. Any parent who thinks that they are not smart enough to educate their child is just wrong. They're just wrong. Do you know everything just because you're the child's educator? No. Do you have areas of weakness? Yes, you do. So what? Even if you went to public school, you'd have areas of weakness. Nobody knows everything. But if you know how to learn and you know where to go find the information, if you don't know it, if you know how to research and go find answers, ask questions, there's nothing to hold you back from anything that's important to know if you'll go after it. Why did Thomas Jefferson have 5 languages mastered by the time he was in his mid-teens? He wanted to. And he went and got the resources and he learned it. And he had the support of his family. Remember, at 14, his father was gone, but had left him and his mother with sufficient resource for him to still be able to gain his education. And finally, that desire kicked in.
And remember, he'd leave parties just to read.
He would carry his books everywhere with him. Joseph Fielding Smith was the same way. He was the same way.
You mean he would leave parties to read?
He would leave a ball game, and they'd find him sitting under a tree reading his Book of Mormon.
Wow.
Yeah. Those who desire it are able to attain it. And that is one of the things that this education system teaches us, is that we're not held back by somebody else's lack of knowledge. We're held back by our lack of desire. Because if your parent doesn't know it, somebody else can be found to help you learn it. Wow, we've just had interruption after interruption after interruption today on this recording. Sorry. Good thing they're not professional. Anyway, if you need to learn something, you can. That is available to us. Always has been. And so just remember that that education that began this country was very, very good. And we're going to get into a little bit more tomorrow into the institutionalization of our education system. We'll get more into what John Dewey did and what happened to our education. So hopefully you've had some interesting things you learned today, and we'll see you tomorrow. Is that Joseph?
Yes.